It had been years since I had last kept in touch with Steven, and I wish now that it had stayed that way. Steven and I first met in primary school. Even at 9 years old each, we were often teased and bullied because we weren't like the other children. We had no interest in sports and listened to rock and metal music. We played musical instruments in video games, not football or hockey. We were shy around people, and all that we really had were each other. We were seen as outcasts at such an early age. And yet this didn't bother us. To this day, it still doesn't really. Yeah, okay, sometimes I detested the teasing and ridiculing, but I had a happy childhood. My parents treated me well and I was never sick. The strange fact about me is that I've never broken a bone, nor have I had a serious illness. I've had the odd head cold and stomach bug, but nothing too serious. My sister was 2 years older than me, 2 years and a month to be exact. She dressed and acted what most people would have described as a tomboy. She always looked out for me, stood up for me, heck, even beat people up for me. As I got older, I got better at standing up for myself. What I lacked in body strength, I made up for in intelligence. Not to sound cocky or anything. People who would insult me, I would just either ignore or tell them what I thought of them. I used big words that nobody could really comprehend at the age of 14. They would just blurt out something unoriginal and stupid like, "Yeah, well, you're stupid," and whatnot. Yeah, brilliant. As I got older, I began to get accepted again. Steven was always accepted by people in secondary, but for me it seemed to take a while. Around the age of 16, if I recall, I guess people just mature. However, it was around this time that Steven had started acting strangely. It was nothing too major, heck. Back then, I didn't even see it as a problem. He started growing a huge interest for psychology, the study of the human brain, of course. He would often go and play tricks and mind games on people, asking people questions and testing them. I remember one day I was queuing at the vending machine for my daily Mars bar, and he came over and asked me, "Would you be willing to skip to the front of the queue right now if there was only one Mars bar left?" My answer instantly was, "No, of course not." People in my school often did skip the queue, but I never really did. I guess I'm just not that type of person. It didn't really bug me. His reply is what got me though. But you see, your subconscious is telling you that the people in front of you are younger than you. They're inferior to you. You could easily knock them all out of your way and they will be helpless to stop you. However, society sees this act as uncivilized, cruel, unsophisticated if you wish. This response had startled me a little, but I brushed it off. I probably should have told somebody looking back on it. The time for college came around and, surprise, surprise, Steven did a course in psychology. I wanted to go to the same university as him to do studies in human resource management, but I didn't get the requirements, so I ended up going to another college instead. We often kept in touch every weekend. He was still the same old Steve, a great laugh, a nice guy, big heart. Very sincere and brutally honest at times, but that was what I loved about him. His love of psychology continued to grow and grow and grow. Sometimes he would talk about their experiments when we were with our group of friends. Some of them were disturbing, such as the prison experiment. There were others that were very brutal that I don't really want to go into. But anyway, we were still the best of friends into our 20s. He met the girl of his dreams and dated her for 7 months before popping the question. Her name was Emily. It was all a bit soon, I thought, but I was happy for him. He treated her like an absolute princess. He was her knight in shining armor. They adored each other. I was a proud best man, passionately delivered a speech, around 6 minutes if I remember correctly, and the ceremony was beautiful. I regret to say that after that, I didn't see him much. I only got to communicate every few weeks or so, which turned into months, which then turned into years. It had been 6 years since I had last heard from him. Often, I had forgotten about him. My job as a health and safety manager had gotten in the way. I was often busy during weekdays, and I shared a small flat with 3 of my workmates, Paul, Rita, and Alexandria. It was a very city-centered-like apartment. A large window in the sitting room gave way to a great view of the city. All the skyscrapers unintentionally decorated the place. Strange modern art portraits on the walls. It was simple but nice. It had everything that you needed. We went out to nightclubs and pubs most weekends, and we were all good buddies. I hadn't seen my high school friends for years at that point. One weekend in a particularly cold March, Rita, Paul, and Alexandria had went for a week away to Greece. They were staying with Alex's mother, so I had the whole weekend and the flat to myself. So I decided that I would get in touch with my old buddy Steven. I still had his cell phone number, and his wife's one for that matter, so I called both numbers. Neither answered. In fact, both of them went straight to voicemail. I decided to chat him on Facebook. He wasn't online, and so I sent him an email. Upon doing so, I scrolled through his page, and it was then that I realized that the last post that he had up was over 4 years ago. Wow, he must have just gone off it. I never really shook off the Facebook fad. Even now, I find myself on it every day and putting up stupid statuses. With a whole weekend free, I decided that I would drive out to his house and catch up. There was no way that he had moved houses. He definitely would have told me if he had. He always informed me of almost everything big in his life. I was the only guy he told that he was going to marry Emily. They had now been together 9 years if my memory serves me correctly. I hoped by driving out that I wasn't intruding or anything. After all, the 2 of them and myself got on very well. So it was decided. With that, I packed my bags, nothing to lose really in case he asked me to stay the night, and I hopped into my Volkswagen and I hit the open road. I still remembered the way to his house, and it was only a 40-minute drive from my apartment. An hour if there was traffic, but I highly doubted there would be at noon on a Saturday. The drive had taken a little longer than I had expected. The area which he lived was still affected by a few inches of snow. The salt trucks must not highly regard this community. A pity, as it was a wonderful neighborhood. Wealthy 1950s housing, very classy looking, quite large, Wisteria Lane almost. Trees lined the paths on the route. The snow just brought out the best of it. As I arrived to his house, it instantly stood out from the rest, but not for a good reason. His house was dark and the color had badly faded. The grass was long and messy. It looked like nobody had been there for years. The same car from 6 years ago when I last saw him was still in the driveway, however. A shiny Audi A4. The time had done it no favors, though. Weeds rather than flowers decorated the lawn. After analyzing the garden, only then had I realized that the windows were all boarded up. I had missed my chance. Why didn't he tell me that he was gone? Why had he left his car here? I had to find out. Luckily enough for me, his neighbor was doing the gardening. I approached him. A tall, skinny man in his 60s. He wore a flowery hat and a plain white shirt. He was smiling and he looked friendly. "Excuse me, but could you tell me where exactly Steven is now?" I inquired. "Oh, I don't think he's been there for a while now," he replied. "Strangest thing is nobody ever saw him leave. The whole family just seemed to disappear. People behind the house say that they only ever saw Steven in the top floor room, and one day, he just disappeared." "That's strange," I stuttered. I was getting anxious now. He answered, "Yep, anytime that anybody called over, nobody answered. Things used to be different. I remembered they used to be great neighbors, and then one day things just kind of changed." He looked at the ground in confusion as he said and then wandered inside. I had to know what was going on. I took a closer inspection of the house. I got an eerie feeling from it. It was like it was watching me. It sounds ridiculous, but that's the truth. I noticed, however, that the garage door was open. I could see a door leading inside of the house. I looked around to see if there was anybody watching me. Nobody. I hesitantly walked towards the garage. About halfway up the drive, I noticed security cameras following my every move. He was always a secure person, but this looked like a nice neighborhood to me. So what was going on here? The garage was pretty normal to me, regular enough. A shelf of tools, old junk that you never threw away lying around, and dusty old cardboard boxes and whatnot. I placed my hand on the doorknob that gave me entry to this house. Twisted. No lock. I searched around the garage in hope of finding a key. I looked through old paint cans, in drawers and on shelves. Nothing. After standing there for a while thinking that I had reached a dead end, I got an idea. As I mentioned earlier, I was never a man of strength or brute force. However, now was the time that I needed it most. I took a few steps and I ran full force into the brown dirty door. Ouch, my shoulder. I repeated my actions. Same result. Finally, I took a few more steps back and I jumped straight into it. The door flung open with me still going full speed through it. I was not expecting a narrow hallway to greet my head. But again, ouch. As I stood up from the door, which was now diagonally standing from its bottom frame to the hallway ceiling, I slipped awkwardly through one of the gaps that I had created. I studied the house that I was now in. It was definitely not how I remembered it. He had completely let his home go. The floorboards were rotting, dust and cobwebs everywhere, broken frames and pictures scattered across the floor, appliances covered in dirt and grime, but the first thing I noticed was the smell. Disgusting, I must say. Have you ever been unfortunate enough to smell a wet dog? Well, this house reeked of it. What the heck was going on? Upon further inspection, the rest of the house was pretty much the same, and I decided to explore the upstairs. Still as I remembered it, it was like deja vu with a hint of nightmare and a sprinkle of dread. The house itself gave me a horrible gut-wrenching feeling. Upstairs was no different from downstairs either. The dirty ceiling, ripped and filthy carpet. The downstairs was a wooden floor, the upstairs was carpet, and there were holes on the wall. Out of the blue, a rat jumped out from one of them, made me jump out of my skin. I was not expecting that. And that woke me up a little bit more and made me alert. And that's when I noticed that room. There can be no description for what I was about to encounter. It was far worse than my worst expectations. At first I noticed a glowing light, and then I noticed it was an LED screen. I walked over ever so slowly. The curtains were closed and the room was dark apart from that screen. Approaching, I noticed more items. A chair, a desk, a filing cabinet. This must have been the room the old man was talking about. Standing right at the door, I noticed the top of a head. Somebody was sitting on it. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. Stephen, I whimpered. I was trembling like an earthquake at this stage. No response. Stephen, I suddenly roared with a distraught flare. Again, nothing. I had no choice. I closed my eyes and reached out in front of me, grabbed it and swung it around slowly, every second feeling like a minute of mental torture. I couldn't bring myself to see what had happened, but I had to. I couldn't just run away from it all. That's what Stephen always told me. Stand up to your fears. Well, I was afraid right now. I mean, absolutely terrified, confused, alone. Part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't. I opened my eyes. Pale, wide, white eyes instantly stared back at me. I groaned loudly to the shocking scene that I was witnessing. Giant rotting wounds with maggots crawling in and out were on his throat and head. Only looking at them, I could feel them crawling all over me. A rusty old pistol was still frozen in one of his dangling hands. The small frown on his face just killed me. I collapsed to the floor instantly and buried my face within my palms. Sobbing frantically, I was in another world. I began to doubt reality. This couldn't be real. I was imagining things. But my imagination is not this powerful. This is too insidious to be one of my nightmares. I slowly began to stand back up. I didn't even look at him. I just couldn't. I just tiptoed past him. Every muscle in the upper half of my body was completely stuck. And then out of nowhere, I grabbed the chair and I ran with it, rolling it along the hallway and violently thrashed it down the stairs. Screw you, Steven. You didn't have to do this. Why the heck did you do this, you son of a... You destroyed so many memories of mine. I paused for a second. My own outburst had frightened me. Staring at the laid-out body at the end of the stairs with an office chair on it, I walked quickly into the room to examine it. I had to know what was going on whether I liked it or not. I studied the LED screen. CCTV footage. I stepped forward for a closer look and what I saw was too much to handle. A plain room with no objects in it whatsoever. A plain white room apart from a giant blood stain on a section of the wall and pools of blood in places. 3 bodies laid there motionless. 2 children side by side and a woman's body near the wall underneath the blood. Shaking, I slowly stepped back. Vomit. Out of nowhere, I just vomited out of pure disgust and shock. What was going on? I just kept asking myself that. How could there be 4 dead people in a house without somebody noticing? I took another look around the room. The desk was covered in old pens and papers. Scrawled out notes, dirty mugs with coffee rings in them and on them. I opened the curtains for a better view of the room. A framed picture of Freud lay on the far wall. Everything here was dusty, cobwebs on the corner of the window. A cabinet stood beside the desk. The top cabinet labeled, Experiment Starving Dogs was highlighted. The other 2 were labeled, Notes and Accessories. The top drawer was locked. No way I was going to force this one open, especially after everything I had just been through. I looked around the desk and its drawers for a key. I looked for about 2 minutes. Top left drawer, bingo, a small silver key. A clicking and rolling sound meant that I was greeted with a few tapes into folder. The folder was labeled Starving Dogs and the tapes were labeled Day 1, Day 9, Day 42, Day 104, Day 235, and finally Day 401. After I grabbed all the tapes in the folder and ran out of there, again, I had just leaped over his body and I ran for the door to the garage. As I was running, I suddenly stalled. There was one last room on the bottom floor that I hadn't explored. My feeling of dread overwhelmed my body once. A steel door with a code connected the white room to what I presumed was the dining room. Of course, I couldn't explore it, but what worried me a lot was that I was curious to see it up front. I had a morbid sense of curiosity right now. I didn't like what this whole situation was doing to me. The realization of this made me run. I squeezed through the gap of the door frame in the garage and door and ran for my car. The weather was now cloudy and dull. It looked like it was going to snow soon. The man acknowledged me as I ran out from the driveway, but he wasn't exactly a priority right now. I stacked the folder and tapes in the front seat and drove as fast as I could. I went to my mother and father's house. There was no way that I was sleeping at home, not after I had been through. The next few days were tough. I explained to my parents everything that had happened and they were really good about it. Mom cuddled me and gave me support and did everything she could to support me. My dad as well. They have always been good parents. I could have sat around for days doing nothing, but I knew I had responsibilities to take care of. I waved goodbye to my mom and dad and hit the road back home. I knew that Alex, Paul, and Rita would be back by now. It had been days since the nightmare that I had encountered. I had called in sick to work for the whole week. Paul had a VHS player that I could borrow, and conveniently enough he had one in the apartment. He was all into his retro movies, a lot of which his dad had passed on to him. He frequently watched them here with us, but we never really got into them. He always persuaded us that they were brilliant. God loves a trier, I guess. That night, I decided to face up to it and play the tapes. I had wondered why Steven kept these particular ones. These ones must have contained important data for his studies. Beforehand, I flipped through the folder. Eventually, I read it all in about an hour and a half. There was a lot of detail to cover, but these were the basics. I couldn't believe how much Steven had changed. I knew that he always loved his psychology, but I was not prepared for what was in store now. There have been a lot of messed up psychology experiments in the past. I should know, he used to tell me about them all the time. Basically, the starving dogs experiment was his. He locked his family up for what was planned to be 3 years. The woman in the room was his wife Emily, and the 2 children were his. 1 boy and 1 girl named Sandra and Michael, ages 5 and 3 at the start of the experiment. This was the first that I knew of the children. He didn't tell me that he was going to do it, which apparently was the whole fun of it. How would humans react to a sudden change in lifestyle from luxury to basic survival? For every day of the experiment, he fed them bread and water. That's it. They had no entertainment at all. No items, not even a toilet. A plain white room, bread and water. That's it. He did this for what was about 2.5 years before he had killed himself. Sicko. I couldn't believe the monster my former best friend had turned into. It was unbelievable. But this was only the beginning though. The tapes were far worse. Day 1 consisted of children that were scared. No idea what was happening, huddled up to Emily for support. The mother was screaming and screaming. Curse words, inaudible words at times. Her volatile reaction was scaring me a lot. It's only natural, I guess. This continued on for a while until the tape cut out. Static contrasted against the dark room that I was standing in. I followed up with day 9. This time, Emily was begging for her release, crying out to be freed. On her knees and absolutely desperate. But the children seemed somehow unaffected. The 5-year-old child Sandra sat solemnly in the corner, with a sad look on her face. Michael seemed unaffected, however. He crawled around like a normal child, looked at the camera with a puzzled look on his face often. I'm guessing too young to realize what malicious act was unfolding. Things started to get disturbing at day 42. Emily was sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth, hair all in a mess and clothes torn up, mumbling absolute gibberish, half of which I could not make out. She sung Happy Birthday over and over for a while and then talked about a dog named Blanket, who she claimed was right in front of her. After that, she had quieted down and started rubbing thin air repeatedly. The children, on the other hand, were fighting rough, kicking, screaming, biting each other. They had an almost evil look in their eyes, and that was it. For the whole tape, they just kicked the crap out of each other. They were beginning to lose it. Day 104 was played after the previous clip had ended. In the clip, Emily kept shouting about worshipping the hollowed-eyed man, and kept screaming at the children. The feces was scattered all over the floor, disgusting. She often cursed at them, spat at them, and threatened them. Often these threats were extremely violent and involved disembowelment, sacrifices, and for one threat, she told Michael that she would rip the skin off his face and wear it as a mask. The children reacted to these by hissing and growling at her, thumping on her leg with clenched fists. The children often ran into walls only to get back up and do it repeatedly. These clips just got worse and worse, however. Day 235 was played next. This one started out again as Emily rocking back and forth like in day 42, mumbling gibberish. Her condition was really withering, as were the children's. The children were just lying there too. Not fighting, not interacting at all, just lying there. Suddenly, Emily stopped and stood up, and this caught my attention. She stood there for about 2 minutes before slowly walking towards the children. Viciously, she picked Michael by the legs and threw him full force against the wall. Sandra got up instantly and ran, but of course the inevitable happened, and Emily did the exact same thing to her. The same wall, both children just lay there. I stood up in shock. This act had come out of nowhere. I found myself whispering, "No, no, no," to the television. She slowly approached one of the children, kneeled down and started biting him. I vomited once more. A mother eating her own would be enough for anyone. I recalled the footage back in the house. Both children lay there with chunks taken out all over them. I turned it off almost straight after that thought. I couldn't bear it anymore. One last tape I had to watch. I had to know what happened. It took me a while to put it in as I kept stalling, but I found the strength to continue watching. The tape began with Emily just staring at one of the walls. She was scraping something in with her nails. I took a closer look. She was writing absolute gibberish again. Apart from the odd random word like mouse, boy, and buzzing. I couldn't make out any of the rest, but the walls were just covered in writing. Letters and numbers. You could barely make them out, but you could see them. She suddenly stopped. She got up and stared at the camera for what was a nerve-wracking 3 or 4 minutes. Her dark, sleep-deprived eyes. Dark purple bags hung underneath them. A pale white face with strings of greasy, unkempt hair streaking across her cheeks. A ghastly image of a once beautiful woman. She still gives me nightmares to this day. My eyes were fixed to the screen. She uttered quietly, "I hope you do the same as me." She started walking backwards, staring at the camera with those wide, dark eyes as she did so. This went on for a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. An eternity. She turned and faced the wall, looking directly at the red splatter of where she had thrown her 2 children. And then it started. She banged her head as hard as she could, while repeatedly shouting, "It's not natural for a human to self-harm," over and over and over again, banging and banging and banging again and again and again. Each hit harder and faster than the last. "It's not natural," getting louder at each whack. It got to a point where it was just constant screaming and banging. I slowly got up and walked backwards while staring at the television. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off of this. It got to a point when there was a pool of blood surrounding her dizzy body. It was slowing her down. Each whack getting weaker and her speech becoming mumbled. Eventually, she collapsed to the floor with the pool expanding from her head. A haunting silence. My breathing was heavier than a boulder. The white silent screen was just there. Too much morbidity in a scene had overwhelmed me. I shut my eyes. The sound of a gunshot ringing inside my own head. Stephen's bloodied body flashing as a night terror in my eyes. My own imagination now torturing me. I instantly collapsed to the floor and sobbed into my palms. Alexandria heard me and came to my support. It took me an hour to calm down. What had caused him to do this? Why did he do this? So many questions that will go unanswered for me. There could have been other experiments, but he had to go with this. I couldn't deal with this now. I needed rest. I haven't slept well the previous week, and this wasn't doing me any good. I could sit around and ponder all I want, but for now, I needed to sleep. That night, I had a nightmare. I was sitting in an office chair surrounded by total darkness. All I could hear were the painful cries and screams of a grown woman. A pistol lay in my left hand. I pulled it up to my throat and I gripped it tightly. Without question, I pulled the trigger. In my dream, I stared at total darkness for minutes. I woke up in a cold sweat, dehydrated. I looked around. Back to reality. I was completely paralyzed by fear. I could still feel the maggots crawling all over me. The following diary entry was recovered from an abandoned house after forensics were sent in to collect evidence for an investigation. Sunday. If there's one thing that I have grown to greatly appreciate over the last few months, it's my wife's irrational thought that all psychologists keep their work life absolutely alienated away from their private life. Emily never was one to question my motives and methods, and when it came to matters that I felt uncomfortable about her snooping around in, keeping her distance from unknown territory was a coded command that you could always rely on her to be obedient about. Much to my pleasure rather than hers. Regarding this, I could tell that Emily's unanswered, curious mind had always wondered what occurred within the small block of these 4 office walls. After all, I can't really blame her. Every speckle of dust, every faded and recent coffee ring, every slam of the cabinet drawers, and every rattle of organizing stacks of paper into a neat, non-overflowing bundle against the desk had its own story, didn't it? After all, you can't really pin this on the cat. He was only responding to his natural territorial instinct. And probably the last thing I felt when I got the call this morning was surprise. I can still clearly visualize the anxiety elapsing Mr. Krakowski's face the moment he received the call from the doctor's office nearly 4 years ago. And the only thing that honestly surprised me was how he hadn't bitten the dust anytime sooner. I would sooner pop myself than to know that I would have to live 4 malcontent years with the diagnostics of lung cancer. On the contrary though, strong-willed Chucky eased through the enfeebling cancer whirlwind and simply continued to go about his everyday responsibilities with an odd kind of masked effortlessness, despite the fact that it shredded him from the inside out like the arduous, bone-shattering burden that he tried to resiliently disguise. He was an excellent employer and a level-headed boss. Well, by our terms he was anyway. Had this expected death come 1 week earlier, it would have crafted the perfect alibi for me. I genuinely hope that Emily and the kids enjoy Florence for the few days, and I only regret that I can't warn them to not take the Italian experience for granted without arousing suspicion for my already bugging wife. There are still plenty of flights that you can book now. We have the money to pay for another seat. The kids and I both want you here. These were among some of these several nags that were aimed at me during the first weeks, and as much as I would love to be with my family, the Fisi have instructed and honored me to carry out their latest ideology in what is expected to be their most controversial yet groundbreaking experiment to date. Isolation, survival, poverty, imprisonment, dehumanization. They all link into what is expected to flourish into this ruthless, starving dogs experiment. Despondency will be key. Monday. What would the Homo sapiens species be like today if the virtue of humanity have never existed or developed, if at all, later than expected? This invigorating thought has frequently labeled my mind since I was about 16 years of age, and it was all that I could precisely be concerned about as I smiled, waved, and gave false words of reassurance to my credulous family as they exited the house for their flight and final time at 5 o'clock this morning. I thought about how this holiday has no meaning to human survival, no benefit to our nature, and simply serves to satisfy the recreational need of the human mind developed by humanity. When you put a lot of thought into it within a short space of time, it's actually scary to think of the amount of services that humanity partakes in. Not just these days, but in the past also, for the sake of the virtue itself. A prime example of this, I believe, is religion. I have always seen religion as a value that is never entirely accomplished or satisfied. It seems to me that no beliefs can have too many members or even too many missions to serve, of whoever or whatever their followers are serving, or even those who guide their followers for either good intentions or power over people, whatever the reason. The result, either you grow into the world's largest religion of over 2 billion, both active and inactive members, or all of your members are either killed or arrested at harrowing scenes in Waco, Texas. The people who strictly follow these organized faiths are really only doing so for one reason: self-fulfillment, to one day go to heaven, to be reincarnated, etc. The more I think about it, I can truthfully say that I cannot think of any other logical benefit of their systems other than to fulfill one's humanity virtue. Going to church every Sunday for an hour, fasting during the day for, 2 weeks, a month maybe. I can't remember the exact guidelines of Ramadan. It's irrelevant anyway because commitments vary in extremity, but I believe the principle behind it is all still relatively akin. I'm keeping this diary specifically separate from the rest of my entries for very good reason. I keep this diary to express my thoughts and judgments during a vital week of my life when my humanity will be the most strained beyond its usual limits. And for some reason, all I can think about is if the contractor is dropping by tomorrow. Maybe it's Wednesday. I'll have to call about that later. Maybe it plagues my head because I'm just too fond of the sitting room that I have right now. The mantelpiece, the blue leather sofa and its 2 stocky armchair companions, the looming glass cabinet of fancy knickknacks, family heirlooms, and personal memorabilia. Memories. For whatever time I step in there for the next, whatever amount of hours until the contractor comes, whooshing images of baby steps, scraped knees and tears, romantic movies with wine chocolates and flickering television lights in a dark room, and rainy days with unfinished Monopoly games are going to flash by me, and all I can't help but do is half-willingly accept it. New memories, old memories replaced with the former of results, discoveries, and observations. Day and night surveillance from my office as they hopefully slowly settle into their new habitat. At first, humanity will take full throttle and there will be confusion, angst, and suffering. That will wither and die as nature should rear its monstrously ugly, yet beautifully ambitious head, and create the scenarios that I will be scribbling notes on and reporting back to Fishi. I wonder when that contractor's coming. We both have a lot of work to do. Tuesday. Make a wish is what my mother would say to me when I was just a 6-year-old boy gathering fluffy dandelions and attempting to blow all the seeds off them in one striking go. 24 years on and looking back at those seeds, forcefully fleeing in the opposite direction of their home, all I'm reminded of is somebody holding a 12-gauge shotgun to their mouth and blowing their brains out, their head dissolving into little mushy pink and red pieces, not flying but drifting quickly towards the wall and ceiling. I'm not paranoid enough to own a gun at the moment, but maybe as time goes by, paranoia will seemingly convert into jittery common sense, and I'll submit to a hesitant deceivement. The contractor came today and removed everything. It was noisy at times, but it was nice to have some background music because I was starting to become uncomfortable with my new solitude, like an unwanted hive that you just can't scratch enough. The pieces of the now plural organ would make a wonderful artistic design for the horrible, eerie empty room. Their revolting presence would go hand in hand, and at least then there would be some sort of scenery to accompany your misery. The brain splatter design and a suicide both share the same value right now. Solution. The steel doors are going to be installed tomorrow and then the walls are going to be painted a blank white. The old man next door gave me a concerned look when I saw him today. He adjusted a nice little smile on his face while he was watering his plants in that flowery hat, but he had an engraved look of apprehension beneath his cracked and rosy red cheeks. Maybe he can read me, or maybe it's the less than average sleep that I've been getting lately, becoming evident through my weary self. Maybe I should get acting lessons from the lovable old man next door. The Stanford prison experiment is something that I have been fascinated by for a very long time. At its very basic core, 24 male students taken under guard and misshaped by psychological torture. It went horribly wrong, of course, and even after just 6 days, the officers involved wanted more. They had power, they had control. They were the ones given the rights to take rough protocol that they had deemed necessary by Mr. Zimbardo himself. My upcoming experiment is too similar to that of the 1971 prison experiment. There may only be one difference, but because I report my findings to a secret organization who keep their dark secrets locked in secured filing cabinets, rather than the US Navy or Marine Corps, it's pretty significant. I am the lead professor behind all of this, and I am open to the exceptionally likely possibility that I will be mutilated into one of those power-hungry prison guard examples, just like a sunset that drains the color out of buildings and trees in a distant horizon. Locked in a room, huddled, scared, basic rations and no means of recreation, meaning or goal to feed their draining and starving civilization. Emily will be worst affected, no doubt. Michael and Sandra, on the other hand, I'm not so sure. They might be too young to realize the confusion that society places on such an act. They'll be like male rabbits in a hut, there from birth, feeding through a drip. I dictate the period in which I wish to observe them. I am their owner. They were family to me once, but now all they are to me are white mice on running wheels and a large black railed cage on blue plastic. Wednesday. There are recent rotting rodent remains in the raw room downstairs, and I am rereading that last line of my previous entry. I paid over 10 grand for all the new installations and I hate it. They are horribly calm and overwhelming, dazingly quiet and eerily too peaceful. Perfect. It's everything I require for my work to go ahead. I have given myself the all clear. Unfortunately, as soon as I had saw that I had diminished a section of my house to absolutely nothing, I panicked and ran back upstairs, little beads of sweat trickling down from my forehead, while I swallowed the quickly reoccurring lump haunting my throat. I have no idea why, but I just couldn't stand it. That there was a thing in my house that contained less content than a plastic bag floating in the wind. Other than for that brief moment that I had experienced it. It was horrifying. White with red. It was such a malignant combination. Like when a roofer slips off the top of a 60-degree angle roof and smacks his temple on the sharp corner of the gray concrete wall. Red flows out a large gashing wound and his skin drains to white, quicker than an endangered chameleon. I sat up in my room quivering from the room's presence, and all I could recollect was the image of the exploding bloody dandelion. Imagining the brain matter slowly seeping down the white wall, with pieces, sooner or later, trickled to the floor making a chunky splattering sound. While my mind had generated this thought, in that moment all I could think was how ventilating those squishy sounds and vivacious colors were. Suicide was simply not an option, as much as I'm contemplating it at the moment. Those nuts at Fishi will do God knows what to my family if I don't carry out their orders. That's why I keep rereading that last line of my previous entry. I fear that there are moments when I'm turning into one of them. Those messed up, rusty-brained, discarding slabs of meat and slime that I worked for and told myself that I respected. Ziggy hadn't a chance. He crawled around in my hands so naively, sniffling and curious. At least his death was quick and facile. The panic, the fury overlapping me. I leaned back and slowly threw him harder than a pitcher trying to strike out the batter. Ziggy lay in a heap on the ground, his body frozen and corrupted from the incident. his black beads for eyes staying so still and his little wiry whiskers flickering like the sound of an old projector shortly after the film had concluded, twitching like sensitive eyes to an unexpected set of siren lights. I put him out of his misery the same way a careless smoker rubs their cigarette butt dry into the ground. Little helpless bones snapped and split under the force of my black boot, and red spurted out both sides like a condensed ketchup packet from a cheap diner. Sandra's beloved hamster Ziggy remained glossy, dead and soaked in red in the room below. The last feelings I want Sandra to think of me are misunderstanding and confusion, not that I'm a monster. Thursday. Depending on whose perspective you were viewing it from, shaving this morning after a sleepless night was either an ill-informed decision or a controversial stroke of luck. I lay in bed all night screaming to the impossible possibility that my sanity is crippled and common sense is shattered into tens of sharp, piercing little pieces. If Krakowski could only see me fall apart like this, he would pick up one of those pieces and slowly steer it into the side of my forehead, like a steady twisting screwdriver. Speaking of injuries anyway, my shaking hand slipped during my shave today, scraping through the delicate skin between my jaw and my throat. Red bloody blobs dotted on my white shirt and white collar. It stung at first and it came as a shock to me as I'm usually cautious going through this regular routine. It was a pretty deep cut, but it was distracting me from the inner anguish that floated freely around inside my head like carousel horses. Those dribbles of blood sliding down my neck while I shut my eyes and allowed my dizzy eyes to drift happily in circles around my head. It was like easing into a batch of morphine, and the release itself was arousing me. At first, I was a little uncomfortable, but if this is what humanity has created for me, then so be it. Even writing about it now, I am gleefully re-establishing the experience and forgetting about all the stuff that I will encounter in a few days. I received 2 expected packages from Fishy in the post today. One box contained Bluetooth-operated CCTV cameras and USB devices for security and monitoring for both outside and the White Room, while the other contained needles and a large, bubbly-like plastic package which contained a chemical that you could tell was hazardous, just on the basis that it was clearer than water and as temperately lukewarm as healthy flesh. The setup was pretty standard, and aside from the odd flicker or a flash of line every few minutes or so, the quality of the cameras had exceeded my expectations. As effective as they are though, video quality has minuscule wealth to me at the moment. The thought that these CCTV footages will be on all day and night for the next few years is honestly so terrifying to me. An age where technology's influence is exceeding too rapidly and nobody seems to care generates huge concerns for me. That machines are one day going to see more than we can and can already observe events at times when we cannot. Maybe staying up the whole night was a good idea. What if Fishy has me wired right now and I just vulnerably allow everything they sent me into my house? What if they're testing me to see if I will comply with their demands and slavishly carry out their dirty work? If my family's going to die, they're not going to die by the hands of Fishy, but I'm still left in a tough situation. If I don't do it, I die, and I don't know what even more horrible act they will carry out on my family. If I do, I survive, but who knows what happens to them if they're going to be locked up there for 3 years. All I can hope is that they will carry on through this ordeal and they will never have to ever see me again. I can live isolated away somewhere where I'm no threat to society, or maybe I can just travel over to the Ephesus headquarters and blow all their freaking evil heads off. I punched a hole in my wall with tears in my eyes. I told myself only 2 days ago that I would never own a gun. I'm getting stressed again. Dark hail clouds shroud my thoughts and I'm getting stressed out. The bandage patch on my neck is getting itchy and I'm stressing out again. I looked in the mirror at my sleepless face again. The crusty healing wound was speckled with blood like dust and I was getting stressed out. I think I'll take just one more slice at it. And good thing those needles are right on my bedside locker. Ah, that felt great. I think I'll do that to my arm now. Too much blood on the floor, but I can't call an ambulance because maybe I'm paranoid now. Should I get that gun sometime? I think I will. Regret for everything. Friday. I look terrible. There's a giant scar on my jaw and several little scars on my upper left arm from where I got carried away last night. This is the first entry that I've written during the daytime, and judging from the brightness outside for this time of year, I would say that it's around 3 o'clock. I checked the clock downstairs, 3:21. I literally just woke 20 minutes ago and I feel really dizzy. I passed out after a strenuous period of heavy blood loss. It's a good thing that I had fainted when I did, or else there was the ostensible chance that I would have traveled further south on the great scraping stress train. How would I explain the scars to my wife? I'm not sure. I guess I'll have to make up some irrational excuse for the gaping crack on my jaw and hide the little reminders under a thick jumper. Actually, memory refreshed. I still have to go clean up Ziggy. The blood had dried onto the wall and it took strained elbow grease, which was in limited supply thanks to my little episode last night, to remove it. I then mopped and scrubbed the floor and threw Ziggy into the bin. I thought that I would be more mentally affected by the action that I had carried out on Wednesday, but honestly, I feel like I'm immune to dastardly performances at this stage. It was times like these that I wish I had kept in touch with Tim a lot more. The one person back in my youth days who actually cared for the interests that I ranted on about, who listened and showed interest for the experiments and psychology theories that I had idolized when I was in my early 20s. During my secondary school days, I had stood up for him a lot and really helped him fit into social groups that he never would have had a chance to become comfortable in if it weren't for my guidance and if it weren't for my assistance. Well, now I really needed him. But he's way too busy for his current low-paying health and safety internship, in which he'll rake the financial benefits of greatly in a few years' time. I just can't help but feel that if I still had Tim to talk to in my life right now, that this problem would have been solved a long time ago. But then again, Fisi have never really taken no for an answer that much in the past, especially to someone who has shown as much loyalty as me towards them. Regardless, I want to be able to share this problem with him, but we haven't spoken in over a year and it's too late now. Rather than him just waltzing down here and saying howdy do to me, he would need to plan his journey and set a time when he was free and not working. I would feel like I'm intruding, which is extremely obscure of me to say because he always had the time for me back in the day. I still remember to this day that moment I came up to him in the line for the vending machine and asked him, "Would you be willing to skip to the front of the queue right now if you knew there was only one Mars bar left?" Had I asked that to anyone else, they most likely would have turned around and given a horrendous look. But Tim was different. He had a sort of restrained respect for everyone, despite had they made him feel uncomfortable or uneasy. Respect, patience, and passiveness were his most appreciated virtues and qualities that sometimes got annoying if you were around them for too long, but traits you miss if you hadn't experienced for a long while. Although there was a 99.9% chance of it not happening, I wish that he would just come and rescue me from this ever so daunting nightmare that I'm in the middle of right now, like a whirlpool of black molten hot tar. A few days ago I had talked about how the development of humanity had some crazy, disturbing effects when you think about them for an extended period of time. In this case, however, my mind struggles to think of a disadvantage when it came to the life policies that my good old friend Tim had. He would die before letting anything happen to his family. The family gets back tonight. I wonder how they'll react when they see the steel doors. Saturday. Screaming, lots and lots of screaming. Emily's going to shred her vocal cords if she doesn't give it a rest soon. The walls are soundproof though, so her valiant efforts are going sadly unrewarded. You would think that this hostile reaction would provoke me to let them out, but not really. It's kind of irritating, to be perfectly honest. The children are huddled up for her support. They're frightened out of their wits, and Emily is really not helping. I muted the volume on the screen, so now it just looks like black and white footage of lost footage from an old abandoned laboratory or something like that. Anyway, this is the last time that I'll be writing in this diary, as the rest of my research will be going into separate books that will be constantly submitted and updated to the Feisty Corporation. The research should contain nothing personal or biased and must be strictly fact-based. Every day is to be recorded on these tapes, and special notes and hypotheses will be kept in a folder labeled The Starving Dogs Experiment. At request, however, one of my fellow colleagues asked me to scribble down one excerpt for her and keep it in a folder as part of my research. They want a very minimal study done on the capture himself, as they deem it unnecessary for some odd reason. They see it as irrelevant. Anyway, I decided to rewrite this one on a separate piece of small paper and store it in the folder. New memories. Old memories replaced with the former results, discoveries, and observations. Day and night surveillance from my office as they hopefully slowly settle into their new habitat. At first, humanity will take full throttle and there will be confusion, angst, and suffering. But that will wither and die as nature should rear its monstrously ugly yet beautifully ambitious head and create the scenarios that I will be scribbling notes on and reporting back to Feisty. As for this diary, it has a sentimental value to me now. I shall keep it locked up in the cabinet above. One day I may go back over it and read my thoughts on the week leading up to what could be a very important breakthrough experiment of my psychology career. Unorthodox, most definitely. Ambitious, we shall wait and see. Emily is still screaming. The diary was found on the upstairs floor, just beneath the suicide victim.